How's it going, everybody? I'm Steve, and welcome back. So, a lot of you may know that Make a Mike the Movie Man is running a challenge in the month of October right now. And basically, what this challenge is that you pick 7 films based on each letter in the month of October. And it just got some of your favorites. They may not necessarily be the best ones. These aren't going to be ranked, obviously. They're going to be, going from October, going from O to R. So, they're not going to be ranked at all, but it's just based on each letter. And I actually I did watch the beginning of Mike's video tonight, and I had already put my list together last night. So apparently we have kind of a match in the first one here, which I found that the letter O was kind of hard to find in my collection. I only wanted to include movies that I have in my collection. So okay, so starting off with the letter O for 1976. This one's directed by Richard Donner, and the movie is The Omen. This one is a very creepy movie. I grew up Catholic, so these kind of movies were really popular during that time. Obviously, there's one that was released like 3 years earlier that's even more popular than this one. But this one's obviously starring a lot of these cast members that have passed away now. But it's Gregory Peck, Lee Remick, David Warner. Also, I think the only one that may still be alive is the kid that played Damien. His name is Harvey Spencer Stevens. So these movies, it's the extra feature if you grew up Catholic. These movies will creep you out even more. So okay, so with the letter C, this one I think a lot of people probably picked other movies other than this one. I just saw this on my shelf and I thought this one's technically horror. That's from 2008 from director Matt Reeves, and the movie is Cloverfield. Very creepy movie. Late 2000s, these kind of found footage kind of films were getting popular, and I think this one's one of the better ones. I think one of the more popular. As far as the franchise, I'm not a huge fan of the other movies in the franchise necessarily. I just love the original. It's very much like Godzilla, basically like the American version of Godzilla, and I loved it. It's just that survival kind of feel, and obviously what happened earlier in the 2000s in New York, it kind of affects you in some ways. But it's just that creepy kind of film where who knows who's going to survive in the film, that kind of thing. But this one is it has a lot of female characters. Leslie Kaplan, Jessica Lucas, T.J. Miller's in this movie, who's in the Deadpool movies until the most recent one. But and also Michael Stahl David. Okay, so for the letter T for 1982, this one's directed by John Carpenter, and the movie is The Thing. Obviously, the creature effects in this were done by Rob Bottin. He was like one of the proteges from Rick Baker. He learned from one of the best in the business, and he didn't even get an Oscar. I don't think he got an Oscar nomination for this. I'm not sure. Let me know in the comments if you know that. But obviously, starring Kurt Russell, has Keith David in it. Just say Kurt Russell. I grew up loving those movies, like the Escape from New York, and just a lot of stuff he did during this time, and basically like early to mid '80s. Really great stuff, like the Big Trouble in Little China and those kind of films. And John Carpenter obviously was a big time director at the time after doing Halloween and The Fog. This one didn't do well at the box office originally because of like E.T. I guess alien kind of films weren't really well received unless they were like friendly aliens. But this one's a iconic horror film, and I think one of the best from John Carpenter. Okay, so for the other O, this one's from 2001 from director Alejandro Amenabar, and it's Spy Number 1195 in the Criterion Collection, but the movie is The Others. Like I said, I didn't have a lot of choices for the letter O, but and just more recently, I did a top 10 of my favorite Criterion horror films, and this one made the list on that one too. So I had to pronounce the director's name in that one too. It's not easy to do, but this one obviously it's starring Nicole Kidman. It's a interesting story. I remember loving this movie in 2001. Had not seen it in several years until Criterion re-released this movie. But when I watched it again, I liked it again. You kind of compare it to another film in the same kind of genre, subgenre from a few years earlier that maybe slightly better movie, more popular in a lot of ways. But this one's a great movie though. Okay, for the letter B, this one's actually from 1988. It's a remake of a 1950s film from Chuck Russell, and the movie is The Blob. This one, obviously, the original film was starring Steve McQueen, but this one's really interesting. It's an 80s film that has a lot more gore than anything you've seen during that time. Really interesting how they amped everything up. I think that's probably the only way they could do this movie. And actually, the screenplay was done by Frank Darabont. If you know, like Shawshank Redemption and The Green Mile and The Mist. He wrote those films and directed those films. But he actually met this director, Chuck Russell, on the Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3, Dream Warriors, during that time. And it's really interesting how they met because if you know, an earlier movie that Chuck Russell wrote was called Dreamscape. And basically, a lot of people would compare this to the original Nightmare on Elm Street from '84 because they were both actually released the same year, but they had no relation as far as Wes Craven had wrote that story several years earlier. Chuck Russell didn't know anything about that necessarily, but they both got released the same year. And if you watch that movie, it looks kind of like something you would see in Nightmare on Elm Street, basically. But Frank Darabont saw the director, saw his work, and invited him to take part in the Part 3 of Nightmare on Elm Street, and so that's why. And he actually directed that film as well. So that's how it all went down. But interesting that they would work together on the Blob and what kind of work they did. I think this movie is kind of underrated in some ways. Okay, so for letter E, I try not to be quite as predictable on this one. I had some other films on my list that would have been a lot more popular than this one, but this one's actually from 1990. It's from director William Peter Blatty, and the movie is The Exorcist 3. This one's really interesting. The way this came about. Basically, William Peter Blatty wrote the original Exorcist film in the book, and he wrote another book called Legion that basically didn't have anything to do with the exorcism, basically, but it had something to do with some of the characters that were in the original film. So basically, William Peter Blatty had only done like one other film before this, and I think that's where some of the flaws are in the movie. Just some of his direction may not have been quite as great. Some of the editing's kind of weird in the movie, but I think what really makes this movie great is the cast. Basically, you've got George C. Scott, iconic actor. It has Brad Dourif, the guy that plays Chucky, was in this movie, and it also has Jason Miller that was in the original film. So I think it's great, though. If you kind of put it all together, it's really great. But you can see a lot of flaws in the movie too. But it does have one of the best jump scares in the movie, probably top 10 favorite jump scares of any horror film in this movie. So I think if you haven't seen this movie, you definitely check it out. Okay, so for letter R, this one's from 1985. I didn't want to be quite as predictable on this one. This is from director Dan O'Bannon, and the movie is Return of the Living Dead. Obviously, the Dead films weren't as common. Obviously, if you saw Dawn of the Dead in 1978, that was an iconic film, but they had kind of taken a little bit of a break during that time. But this one's really interesting. Obviously, Dan O'Bannon, I think he wrote like the Alien script, and for him to direct this, he actually did the screenplay for this movie. But what's really interesting about this is that John Russo that did the original. He wrote the screenplay for Night of the Living Dead in 1968. He actually wrote the story for this one, and Dan O'Bannon wrote the screenplay. And he was like, I think John Russo, he's like one of the co-writers of the story. But this one's really, really fun. There's a lot of comedy in this movie. It's definitely a dark comedy. They made a sequel to this, which I don't think is as good, but the original's really great. The zombies are really great. It's just that you can have so much fun watching this. You can kind of laugh at it. It has definitely like a punk rock kind of vibe to it. But obviously it has a Tom Matthews, James Karen. If you saw Poltergeist, he was in that movie. It has a Linnea Quigley's in this movie too. She's really famous in the horror genre. Okay, everybody, so I really appreciate watching this video. Please leave in the comments, let me know 7 films that you would use using the letters from October. Please enjoy this Halloween season. Please be safe out there, and everybody have a great night.